Hi everyone and welcome to another video. Now something that I'm really keen to do is to appeal to new anglers to the sport. Now whether you're already an angler but you're new to lure fishing, or maybe you're new to fishing in general and you just need that little bit of guidance, I think lure fishing is a fantastic thing to get into, especially if you're a kid. It's a very exciting way of fishing and it's very active. But there is so much information out there now, it's hard to know where to start. When we go into a tackle shop, it's what do I need, what do I buy, what don't I buy? You know, it can be a little bit of a minefield. So what I'm going to talk about today is it's the technique that I started on, and it is the technique that I would recommend anybody that's a beginner and just getting into lure fishing. This is definitely where I would start, and that is a standard jig head with some kind of a shad style bait with a paddle tail. Now, the reason for this is that fishing a shad on a jig head, it can lay some really strong foundations for your future fishing. You can learn so much about lure fishing by just fishing this technique. It is amazing. You know, whether it's counting a lure down, or dragging a lure along the bottom, or hopping it all the way in, or fishing it just under the surface. There is so many options that you can do with fishing a jig head and a shad. It's what you will learn doing that is transferable into other techniques when you start to progress. So let's say I'm going to take you out tomorrow for your first ever lure session. What am I going to recommend that you start with? Now, how I started was fishing on little 4cm shads, and I was catching loads and loads and loads of fish. Now, I didn't catch many big fish. I caught very few big fish to start with. Now, big fish will come. This is what you sort of mindset that I would try to instill into someone who's just starting out. That don't worry about the big fish, because they are going to come in the future. You know, you can catch a massive fish on small baits, but when we're being a little bit more big fish specific, that can come later on. So to start with, I would always recommend you start on a really small bait, something like this. This is the 4.5cm gunky Rockstar on a little micro jig head. It is perfect, and the reason for this is because you will catch everything on this, from 1 ounce perch to nigh on 30-pound pike. I've had roach on these, I've had bream, rudd. I've had friends who have had tench on them. I've had other friends that have had carp on them. They are just really good for bites. And the one thing that I would want you to do to start with, and that is to get plenty of bites, because the main thing is we need to build confidence in getting bites on artificial baits. And by using a small shad, that is definitely, in my opinion, the best way to do that. So there are two really important things about fishing shads before we even get out to the actual fishing side of it. Now, the first one sounds really easy, but it's surprisingly easy to get it wrong, and that is rigging them up. Now, you're going to have to excuse me in this video because my left hand is somewhat out of action at the minute, so I'm trying to do my best with my 3 fingers. So what we do is we take the jig head and we take the shad, and we lay the shad along the shank of that jig head. So what we want to find out is where that hook is going to come out of that lure. Again, I'm making a bit of a pig's ear of this for obvious reasons, but what we do is when we get to that point where we know where the hook needs to come out, we grab the lure where that is, then we get your hook point, and we just make a slight nick on the top of that lure. Again, I don't know if you can see, but there is a slight nick just there, and that is where the hook needs to come out of. So we take the hook point and we put that in what we would deem the centre of that fish's mouth. Like if this was a real fish, just imagine where its mouth would be, and go right through the centre, and really slowly make sure you're threading that on the hook nice and straight. Now when you've done that, it should look something like that. And then all we do is push that shad all the way up to the jig head. And then what we've got there is a perfectly straight shad. and that is going to swim nice and straight through the water. The action is going to be spot on. If we thread it on too close to the actual jig head or not close enough, you know, the bait's just not going to sit right on that jig head, and it's just not, the presentation's not going to be as good. So that is the first thing. Now the second thing is to make sure we have enough weight on that jig head to make that tail kick. Now if we was just to get to the lake, the river, wherever we might be fishing, cast it out and reel it in, that tail's going to be kicking, and we think, well, okay, that's it, job's a good one. But what we need to do is, when we get to the venue we're fishing, put it in the margin and let it fall under its own weight. Now what we're looking for is that tail to kick as that's falling to the bottom. If it's not kicking, when that's falling, if that's just coming down like that and we're not getting a lot of movement out of the tail, the chances are the jig head is not heavy enough to get that tail to kick. So if that is the case, then we would then put, this is a 1.5 gram jig head. If I was to try this and I wasn't getting the movement from the tail, I would then go up to like a 2 gram or a 2.5 gram, depending on how much weight it takes to get that tail to start moving. That's really important, because one of the best ways to fish a shad is in short bursts. In other words, we'll a couple of turns of the handle to get it to come forward, stop reeling, and every time we pause, that's going to fall down to the bottom. So when it's falling, we really do need that tail to kick, and to do that we need to make sure that jig head is the correct weight. So we can tell a lot about how much weight a shad is going to need to get that tail to kick by looking at the wrist of the tail. So if you look at this bait here, it's quite a long thin wrist, and it's got quite a big paddle tail on it. Now what that will tell me is that that is not going to need a huge amount of weight to get that tail to start kicking as it should. Now I've used this particular bait down to 1 gram jig heads, and the tail has been working perfectly. But again, what we need to do is, with the venues that we fish, it's going to vary massively to the weight we need to fish those venues effectively. So what I mean by that is, if we're fishing a river that's got a very strong current, we might need 7 gram or 10 gram or 14 gram or whatever it may be. But if we're fishing, let's say, a small pond or a smaller river or a drain that has very little flow, we're only maybe going to need a jig head weight of 1.8 gram or 2 gram or 3 gram or whatever it may be. So what we can do with that, once we know how much weight we need to fish the venues that we're going to be fishing, we can then match the shads that we buy to the weight we need. So again, if we're fishing like the venues I've just mentioned, small ponds, small rivers with not a lot of flow on them, that type of thing, you want to be looking for shads that have got that nice thin wrist to the tail, because again, we don't need much weight to fish these style of venues. So it's not going to, so we want shads that don't need a huge amount of weight to get the tail to start to kick. Now on the flip side of that, if we was fishing some quite powerful rivers where we might need a lot more weight to get to the bottom, then baits like this, this is a gunky bumpy, you see how much thicker the wrist of that tail is? That's going to need more weight to get that tail to kick properly than what one of these little rock stars is going to need. So that is a really good indicator into the type of shads that you want to be looking for, and basically match the shad to the weight you need to fish those venues. So hopefully that makes sense. A little bit of a long-winded way of going about that. But right, so when we're fishing a shad, another thing that is really good about shads is you can catch fish on these on the coldest day of the year and the hottest day of the year. They work all year round, and you can use them as search baits. Once you've got some bites, you don't need to change if you don't want to. You can pick that area apart with the same lure, just fishing it slightly different. So they're a very versatile bait with how you can fish them and when and where you can fish them. So in the summer, the warmer months, early autumn, things like that, I would cast these out. I would only let them fall maybe a foot or two. I would engage the reel and just do a nice steady retrieve. You know, I wouldn't go too fast, just nice and steady. And in the warmer months, the fish are going to be in them upper layers, so it's a little bit pointless letting it come right down to the bottom. If it's really hot, maybe the fish are a bit more lethargic, then we can sort of start searching the bottom layers. But to start with, I would always look for the active feeding fish, because at the end of the day they're the easy ones to catch. So if we can catch the easy ones, and then we can worry about the more difficult, the more negative fish later on. So that is how I would fish these a lot in the warmer months. Now when we start getting into later autumn, winter, things like that, I will fish these completely different. So in the summer I will fish them like I've just explained. But again, if we start trying to get these sort of like the more negative fish, the lazy ones, the ones that are a bit more inactive, I'll cast these out, I'll let it sink straight to the bottom. And what I will use is the rod to move the lure. Now the reason I'll do that is because where I fish there's lots of weed. So if I'm going to let that sink to the bottom, I don't want it to come too far forward where it's going to pick up a lot of weed. So what I'll do is I'll give the rod a twitch. So I want to bring this lure up sort of against the weed, so it's sort of going with the weed, and then it's going to fall back down again, and then I'll repeat that all the way in, but just by snapping the rod. Now in the winter, when that weed has died down, I don't want this to come too far off the bottom. I want this to stay closer to the bottom. So what I will then do is in the summer I will have my rod at like that 11 o'clock position, and again I'm snapping it up. In the winter and in the colder months, or if I'm fishing for fish where the weed isn't so much of an issue and I want this to stay closer to the bottom, I will have the rod sort of pointed more at that sort of 7 to 8 o'clock position, and all I will use now, I will not move the rod at all, and I will use the reel, because then I want it to come forward and I don't want it to come too high off the bottom. That's why when I will use the reel over the rod to move the bait. So in the summer I'll snap the lure up, use the reel to pick up the slack line, and then snap the rod again. In the winter I will not move the rod at all, and I will just use the reel. And like I say, depending on the venue that you're fishing or what the fish want that day, it will depend if you want this bait to come up off the bottom or if you want it to sort of travel as close to the bottom as possible. So they're sort of like the main style, the main retrieves that I will use. Again, I don't want to complicate this video too much. I don't want to go too in depth into everything that you can do. I'm just trying to cover the basics for now. So once you've sort of got to grips with fishing shads, you know, your little 4.5 centimetres, your 5 centimetre baits, and you want to start to be a little bit more big fish specific, where you want to catch a bigger average size. Now, I'm not a massive believer in big baits catch bigger fish, but I do believe that big baits catch less small fish. So let's say you go out with that and you will catch, let's say over a course of however many days fishing, let's say you get 100 fish to this lure. Now it may take 100 fish to get a 2-pounder. If you then go up to something around a 7 centimetre size, the way I like to look at it, I might catch 50 fish to catch my foot to get to a 2-pounder. So that's how I tend to look at the sort of sizes that I'm catching on lures to the size of the bait that I'm using. The bigger the lure I go, the less bites I'm going to get, because you're going to get less small fish, if that makes sense. So on this, your average size is going to be bigger purely because you're going to catch less small fish. So that would be like my next step with shad fishing. I'd fish them exactly the same, but I'm just going up a size. This is a Gunky Pepsin 7 centimetre. Again, it's got a nice thin wrist to the tail. It doesn't take a lot of weight at all to get that tail to kick properly. So that's another really good one if you're fishing either weedy venues or venues sort of 6 foot and under. Now, if you're an angler that you just enjoy catching predatory fish and you're not species specific as such like I am with the perch, this is a really good option. This is again the Gunky Peps, but this is the 9 centimetre. It's a very thin bait, but it's got quite a deep body. And what you're going to get with this is when it's coming in, the tail's kicking, you're going to get a fair bit of side to side roll. Now, anyone that's done any shad fishing for pike will know how effective having a bait that rolls, because you get that contrast from the clear belly and the darker back, is an excellent pike bait, this one. You will catch some whacking great perch on it, you'll catch small perch on it, but going up to that 9 centimetre size, this is the kind of size that I would start to use if I just wanted to go out and I just wanted to have a fun day's fishing. I've got a chance of a really big perch, but I've also got a chance of catching numbers of pike. We don't get zander in my area of the country, but I have spoken to quite a few anglers that use this sort of size bait who do fish for zander, and they do really well on it. So 9 centimetre, that is sort of like the size I would go for if you just wanted to catch predatory fish. Now, when we start getting onto colours, this sort of colour, the black back with the chartreuse belly, or the blue back with a chartreuse belly, I found these colours work really well in 2 specific conditions. One is really coloured water. Now, if I was fishing this in flood water, what I would do is I would put a slightly heavier jig head on than what I would usually fish. The reason being is I want this to stay as close to the bottom as possible. So let's say I would normally use 3.5 gram on a bait like this. I may go to 5 gram or even 7 gram because I want it to stay close to the bottom. In flood water, your fish will tend to sort of sink down a bit and move into the margins. So I want, by having a slightly heavier weight, again, I will have the rod tip pointed very low to the water, sometimes with the tip even under the water, and I would literally go 1/4 of a turn at a time because I don't want this bait to move too quickly. If this is in like the strike zone where in an area where you're confident that there may be fish, I want this to stay in that strike zone for as long as possible. So by using a slightly heavier weight, small turns of the reel, I'm creating sort of puffs of silt or whatever like the bottom may be made out of, because I'm using a heavier weight. And again, this for whatever it is with this colour, it just seems to work in those conditions. And the good thing about this is the Gunky Rockstar in the slightly bigger size, and it's got what Gunky call the sugar belly concept, which is basically a ribbed belly. Now, another great thing about this bait in coloured water, because of the ribbed belly, it holds scent really well. So I tend to use the Ilex gels. They stay on the lures for ages, but by having that ribbed belly, it just seems to stick a little bit better. So this is really good in coloured water. Now, the other conditions, which is the complete other end of the scale, which I really like, chartreuse and black or chartreuse and blue, is in crystal clear water but in low light conditions. So that first hour of light and the last hour of light. I don't know why. I had one particular day where I was using my more natural colours because I'm fishing very clear water, getting the odd bite, nothing major, and I ended up putting on a chartreuse and blue crankbait, and I absolutely smashed it that morning. I could not believe the amount of bites that I was getting on that colour, and it's been something that I've noticed several times since. I've been using other colours, I've gone back to chartreuse and blue or chartreuse and black. Now, whether that be a shad or a crankbait, whatever it may be, there is something with that colour in clear water but low light. So again, something like this would be like my sort of go-to colours. Now, if you're fishing in really clear water and we've got past that stage where it's first light and it's now, let's say, it's middle of the day, again, let's using the Rockstar as an example. This is the crystal brown colour, and I don't know if you can see from the video, but this is almost transparent. You can see near enough straight through this lure. This looks so natural in the water, especially in this size. It's a very similar size bait to a lot of the pin fry that we get in the summer, and this one can just be a fish catching machine in that colour, again in clear water, throughout the middle of the day, throughout the summer, any time of the day in the winter if we're fishing clear water. I love that colour, really, really effective. Now, if we're in that sort of, let's say, 10 to 12 inches to about 3 foot of visibility, the IU, that is my all-time favourite colour. I've caught in coloured water, I've caught in clear water, I've caught in the summer, I've caught in the winter, I've caught in the autumn on it. There is something about that particular colour and it just works. I can't really explain it any better than that. It just catches fish, that colour. So if I could only use one colour for the rest of my life, it would be some kind of an IU colour. So yeah, that is my absolute favourite, that. And if you are fishing canals or venues that sort of average a much smaller size fish, the little tipsies, things like that, again, it's ribbed. So if you're fishing coloured water, a lot of the canals are really dirty and coloured. This is another really good option because of how well it holds scent. So that Ilex gel on something like this, it's going to really give the fish something else to hone in that coloured water. So I think that is about it. Again, I could talk for ages about this technique. you know, I mean, I can go really in depth with the jig heads as well, but we'll save that for another video. What style of jig head to use for what, because this video has already been going on for nearly 20 minutes. So I don't really want to add another 10 just talking about jig heads, and we'll save that one. But if there's any more information that you want to know, anything you want me to go a little bit more in depth into, just drop it in a comment, or what you want to see in the next videos, drop that in the comment. I will do some crankbait videos and some top water videos before we get to the 16th of June. But again, anything that you want to see, just drop it in the comments, let me know, and I will address it at some point going forward. Cheers.